He was hit by a car on the side of the road in Seattle. He woke up in the mud, in the rain, with 4 arrows piercing his heart. And behind the backs of those ready to kill him, he can already see the bigger picture. Their fortress won't survive the winter. And he is the only one in this whole world who knows why. The cold strikes before the pain. Daniel chokes on water. He rolls onto his back. 4 women stand over him. Their bows are drawn. The arrowheads are aimed at his chest. One is gripping her spear so tightly her knuckles are white. He doesn't understand where he is or why his whole body aches as if he'd been thrown off a roof. But one thing strikes him immediately. The girl on the left is holding the bowstring with 3 fingers, and her elbow is trembling. She's more afraid than he is. No one will shoot right now. That gives him a minute, maybe 5. He slowly raises his open palms, and then he notices the palisade behind them. The logs are dug in crookedly. The bottom logs have turned black. Rot is creeping along the right edge, and 2 logs have already tilted away from the vertical. The southwest corner will collapse by spring. He realizes this in a second. And immediately he realizes something else. He thinks in a language he doesn't know. Foreign sounds fit his thoughts as naturally as his own. He opens his mouth and speaks in perfect Heron. Your southwest corner will sag by spring. Allow me, I'll show you why. The bows don't lower, but the arrows don't fly. The elder woman with the spear takes a step forward. Tall, sharp cheekbones, a wet knot of hair, a scar on her eyebrow. She orders him not to move and signals the others quickly and quietly. A stranger, a man, alone, unarmed. They lift him up. They don't help him stand, but hoist him up like a sack of grain. They lead him behind the palisade. He walks and reads the ground before fear sets in. Clay mixed with sand, sloping toward the northeast. That means water flows that way. That means it's low-lying and damp all summer, and you can't build there. Beyond the palisade, a camp comes into view. 3 dugouts covered with sod. One is leaning. The fire pit is lined with stones incorrectly. The heat rises upward instead of spreading out. They warm themselves by the fire, which gives them a third of its heat. A well on the right. The rope on the gate is half worn through. Faces peer out of the dugouts. Only women's, young and old, some with a child, some with a bandaged arm. He counts 12, then 19, then loses count because he's pushed into the farthest dugout. It's dark inside. It smells of damp earth and smoke. The elder follows him in. She places her spear at the entrance so she can reach it in half a second. She sits down opposite him. She is silent. He asks first where he is. The northern outskirts. The land between the Choi clan and the Han clan. Whose territory? No one's. Who are you? She remains silent for a long time, silent. Then she utters a single word. Outcasts. He nods. No man's land. Women without a clan. A wall that won't survive the winter. And him. An engineer, builder from Seattle. 7 years on landslides and in earthquake zones. In a body younger and weaker than before. He clenches his fist. His grip is weak. The body of a 25-year-old guy who's never worked with his hands. She asks his name. Yuna. Cho Yuna. Daniel. She replies that he's not welcome here, that a stranger was found naked without a clan mark, and according to the laws of any of the 12 clans, he would have been left where he was found. But they have no clan, and that means no laws. How many of you are there? 42. How many children? 7. Are there any sick ones? She hesitates. 2 have been suffering from stomach aches for a month because of the water. 1 coughs so badly that the whole dugout can't sleep. A 4-year-old girl has a wound on her leg that won't heal. Daniel listens and counts. 42 women, 7 children, 1 well. Fall has just begun. 3 months until winter. He asks to inspect the well. Eunice sizes him up with her eyes. A stranger who asks to see the well instead of food. Who assesses the wall before he starts to fear it. She stands up. Let's go. The rain won't let up. The women watch in silence. Some with curiosity, some with open hostility. The little noisy one with smeared hands steps forward and asks who he is. Yuna replies that she hasn't decided yet. The little one snorts. If he's useless, at least let him haul firewood. He takes note of her. At the well, he sniffs the water in the bucket. A metallic taste. It's murky. He asks for a rope. He ties it around himself. He climbs down. The log cabin inside is sturdy. The cracks are caulked with moss. Someone built this with care 20 years ago. The water is 4 meters deep. He scoops from the bottom. He brings it to his face. And the smell changes. Not iron. Worse. He climbs up, looks up the slope. The hill rises about 15 degrees. The earth is darker. The grass is thicker. He climbs up. Yuna follows him. After 70 steps, he crouches down. He pokes at the ground with a stick. He sniffs. He returns. 3 people are already waiting by the well. The little one with dirty hands. The tall, quiet one with sunken eyes. A very young woman in strange glasses made of something transparent. He says the well is fine. The structure is sturdy. The water was clean. But higher up the slope is an old pit. Maybe a cesspit. Maybe a cattle graveyard. In the spring it flooded and seeped down through the soil straight into the aquifer. That's the taste. That's the sickness. The pit needs to be filled in. The well needs to be lined with rich clay from the eastern hill. In 2 weeks, the water will be clean. Yuna is silent, then quiet. They've been drinking this water for 1.5 years. Not a single man from the clan that drove them out told them what he said in an hour. He doesn't know what to say. He just sees the problem and sees the solution. For him, it's like breathing. Look at the ground, catch the slope, trace the path of the water. He's been doing this every day for 7 years. What is a mystery to them is a 10-minute task for him. And for the first time under this rain, in a foreign body, he doesn't feel lost. He feels needed. That his craft is worth more here than any sword. They give him a shovel, a heavy, awkward wooden one. He digs slowly. His body won't obey him. His palms are raw and bleeding after half an hour. By evening, he has dug 1/3 of the pit. Not much, but he has packed down the bottom, laid down the first layer of clay, shown them how to continue. 3 women are watching. Then one takes a second shovel and stands beside him. Then a second. By sunset, there are 5 of them, and the pit is half filled. In the darkness, they lead him back. They give him a bowl of porridge, thick and bland. He eats it all. He collapses onto the mat. His body is on fire, and his head is full of numbers. Slope, depth, soil-bearing capacity, people, food, firewood. Behind the wall, that woman is coughing. The dugout is damp. There's no ventilation. The smoke creeps along the floor and won't go away. She's not coughing because she's sick. It's the smoke and the dampness. He'll fix that too. A blueprint is forming in his head. A stove made of stone and clay, with a chimney that drives the smoke upward while keeping the heat inside. He built ones like this after the landslides in Oregon for people in temporary shelters. 3 days of work. Tomorrow he'll tell Yuna about the stove, about the drainage, about the wall, that the southwest corner needs to be taken apart and rebuilt on a bed of gravel. Otherwise, by spring, it will topple over and a hole 2 men tall will gape in the wall. He falls asleep with the blueprint in his head. His first night in Hayren. His first night in a world where his knowledge is worth more than gold. He doesn't realize it yet, but the 42 women behind the wall have already begun to sense it. The morning began with a scream. Daniel woke with a start. Behind the dugout wall, someone was calling for Yuna. The voice was sharp and high-pitched. He made his way outside. A gray sky. The rain had stopped, but the air was damp and heavy. 6 women stood around the central fire, all talking at once. He stepped closer and made out what they were saying. During the night, the wall of the outermost dugout had collapsed, the very one where the 3 of them had been sleeping with the children. No one was hurt, but half of their belongings were buried under wet earth. Yuna stood there listening. Her face was calm. Only the muscles on her cheekbones betrayed her tension. The little one with dirty hands, the one he remembered from yesterday, was waving her arms and saying that she had warned them, that the wall was wet, that the turf wouldn't hold, that they should have reinforced it a month ago. Yuna asked her how to reinforce it. She fell silent. Daniel walked over to the collapsed dugout. He crouched down. He looked. The wall hadn't collapsed. It had slid down. The soil had become saturated with water and lost its grip. A classic case. He'd seen this dozens of times. Drainage. Drainage is needed. A trench around the dugout, knee-deep, sloping away from the walls. Gravel at the bottom, if available. If not, brushwood and coarse sand. The water would drain into the trench instead of soaking into the walls. He stood up straight and told Yuna this. She looked at him, then at the dugout, then back at him. She asked how long it would take. He replied that it would take 1 day if he were given 4 people with shovels. She nodded. She turned to the women. She called out 4 names. They looked at Daniel. One of them, the tall, quiet one with sunken eyes, crossed her arms and said she wasn't going to dig on a man's orders. Yuna replied that she wasn't digging on his orders, but because she'd slept in a puddle yesterday. The tall woman paused. Then she picked up a shovel. They dug. Daniel marked the line of the trench with a stick on the ground. He showed the slope. He showed the depth. He explained why. Not just digging, but digging with a slope of 3 fingers for every 10 steps, so the water would flow on its own, so it wouldn't stagnate. The little girl with dirty hands stood nearby and watched. Then she asked how he knew that. He replied that he had studied it. She asked where. He said far away. She snorted and said that far away wasn't an answer. He smiled, for the first time in 2 days. Her name was Soyeon, Han Soyeon, 22 years old. Her hands were smeared not with dirt, but with coal. A piece of a charcoal pencil stuck out from behind her right ear. She wasn't just watching him mark out the trench. She was memorizing it. He could see it in her eyes. She was calculating the slope, estimating the depth. He recognized that look. That's how people who know how to build look. By noon, the trench around the first dugout was ready. Water from yesterday's rain had already begun to run down it instead of soaking into the wall. Daniel showed the women how to dig the same trench around the other 2 dugouts. While they dug, he went to the palisade. Yuna went with him, silently. He walked the entire perimeter. The palisade stood in an uneven ring around the camp, about 140 paces in circumference. Logs of varying diameters, some fresh, some old and gray, dug in to varying depths. In 3 places, there were gaps between them a hand's width wide. The southwest corner, the one he'd mentioned on the first day, had sagged more than he'd thought. 2 logs were already wobbling if you pressed on them with your hand. He stopped at that corner and began to explain. The logs are dug straight into the clay without a cushion. The clay gets wet and loses its density. The log starts to wobble. In winter, the water in the ground will freeze and expand. It will push the log up by 2 or 3 fingers. In the spring, it will thaw and the log will settle, but it will be crooked. After a year or 2 of such cycles, the log will fall out. You need to remove the logs. Dig the holes a full arm's length deeper. Place a layer of stones at the bottom, large ones first, then small ones, then tamp them down, and set the log back on the stone foundation. Water will drain through the stones instead of pooling around the tree. Yuna listened. Then she asked how many logs needed to be repositioned. He replied that the entire southwestern section, 23 logs. She asked how long it would take. He replied that a week, if 8 people worked half a day each. She asked why only half a day. He replied that because they still needed to hunt and cook food and stand guard and live. Construction couldn't take up all their time, otherwise people would get sick from exhaustion and hunger, and everything would fall apart. Yuna looked at him differently than she had yesterday. Yesterday she had been assessing the threat. Today she was assessing a resource. He sensed it, and he didn't know which was worse. After inspecting the palisade, he asked to be shown everything. Yuna led him around the camp. 3 dugouts, a central fire pit, a well. Behind the camp to the northeast, a gentle slope led down to a stream that flowed like a thin thread over a rocky bed. The water in the stream was cleaner than in the well, but the stream was far away, 300 paces from the stockade. In winter, with the snow and wind, it would be hard to walk there every day for water. To the east, a sparse forest. Birch, aspen, a few pines. There were trees, but few of them, and they were small. To the south, hills with outcrops of rock. He walked over, crouched down. He touched it. Limestone, soft, layered. Not the best building stone, but usable. And most importantly, there's plenty of it here. He returned to camp by evening, sat down by the fire, asked Soyan for some charcoal and something flat. She brought a piece of bark. He began to draw a map of the camp, as it is now. 3 dugouts, a well, a palisade, a campfire. Then he drew a second map next to it, how it should be. A stove inside each dugout with a chimney leading outside, drainage ditches around each structure. The stockade moved onto stone foundations. A new shed for storing firewood so it wouldn't get wet. The outhouse moved further away from the well, a minimal set for a month's work. The women approached one by one. They looked. Soyan sat down nearby and looked not at the drawing, but at his hands, at the way he drew the lines, smooth, confident, each one meaningful. She asked what those marks next to the lines were. He explained, measurements. This little line means 1 cubit. This one means 2. She nodded. Then she said quietly that in the Khan clan, they had taught her to sketch temple columns, that she knew how to lay stone, but they had forbidden her because a woman cannot lay stone for the gods. He looked at her soot-stained fingers, at the pencil behind her ear, at the eyes in which something burned that he knew well, a thirst to create. He said there were no gods here who forbade such things, and he handed her a piece of charcoal. She took it. Her hand didn't tremble. Another woman approached the fire, quiet, thin, with alert eyes that moved quickly. She wasn't looking at the sketch, but at Daniel, appraisingly. She asked Yuna if she could. Yuna nodded. The woman sat down and introduced herself. Park Min-ji, 26 years old, the Pak trading clan. She asked Daniel how much stone was needed for what he had drawn. He answered. She asked how much wood. He answered. She asked how many workers. He answered. She nodded and said that the stone in the southern hills belonged to no one, but the wood in the forest to the east might already be marked with notches by the Cho clan. If they started cutting it down, there could be problems. Daniel looked at her closely. This wasn't a question from a random woman. It was the question of someone who thought about supplies and consequences. He asked if she had seen the notches herself. She replied that she had, on the distant pines, but not on the birches closer to the camp. He nodded. He said that in that case, they would take only birch and aspen. They wouldn't touch the pine. She nodded with something resembling approval. In the evening, Yuna came to his dugout. She stood at the entrance. He was sitting inside, redrawing the sketch onto a second piece of bark, because the first one was already completely covered. She said that the Council of Exiles had discussed him. Not him personally, but the situation with him. That 4 of the elders wanted him to leave. That 3 said he should stay as long as he was useful. That she hadn't voted. He asked why. She replied that it was because she hadn't decided yet. He said he understood, and that if they decided he had to leave, he would leave. But he asked for 2 days. 2 days to show what he could do. Yuna was silent. Then she said 2 days was too long. He said 1. She said that tomorrow he would show them the oven. If the oven worked, he would stay. If not, he would leave. He agreed. She left. He lay in the dark and thought. A stove. Just one stove. One night to figure out the design using what's available here. Limestone. Rich clay. Sand in the stream bed. He needs a firebox, a chimney, a base, an air vent, all from materials at hand. No cement, no bricks, no tools except his hands and a stick. He'd done this in Oregon 2 years ago, after the landslide that wiped out half the town. People were living in tents. It was cold. Overnight, He designed the simplest stove out of stone and clay. They built it in the morning. By evening, the tent was warm. He can do it again. He must do it again. Because if this stove doesn't work by tomorrow evening, he'll find himself alone on no man's land between two clans, without food, without weapons, without warm clothes. And then his knowledge would be worth nothing. Because knowledge without the help of others is just thoughts, and thoughts freeze faster than fingers in the cold. He closed his eyes. He began to count. He got up before dawn. His body ached from yesterday's work. His palms were cracked and swollen. He flexed his fingers, bent them, straightened them. Painful but bearable. He went outside. The sky was clear for the first time in 2 days. The cold air smelled of wet earth and pine needles. He walked toward the southern hills, alone. No one stopped him. Maybe because Yuna had warned them. Maybe because no one believed he would run away. He had nowhere to run, and everyone knew it. On the hills, he found what he was looking for. Flat limestone rocks, layered. They split cleanly along the layers if struck just right, smooth slabs, perfect for a stove hearth. He chipped off 6 pieces, each the size of his palm. Heavy. He carried 2 at a time, 3 trips. By the time he returned, the camp had woken up. The women watched as he stacked the stones at the entrance to the dugout where the sick woman was coughing. Soyeon approached first. She asked what he was doing. He replied that he was building a stove. She asked if she could help. He said he needed sand from the stream and clay from the eastern hill, and stones, lots of stones, round ones, about the size of a fist, for the firebox walls. She left and returned an hour later, not alone. 4 others were with her. They carried baskets of clay and stones. Daniel got to work. First, he cleared a space inside the dugout near the far wall. He leveled the floor. He laid the first layer of flat stones. This is the hearth, the foundation on which the fire will rest. The stones must fit tightly, without gaps. He fitted them by hand, chipping away at the edges with another stone, slowly, meticulously. Soyeon sat nearby and handed him stones. She watched his hands, memorizing. Then she began fitting the stones herself. He looked at her work, neat, precisely. Hands accustomed to delicate work. He nodded, and they worked together. He built the walls of the firebox from round stones, binding them with a mixture of clay and sand. 1 to 2. 1 part clay to 2 parts sand. Too much clay, and the wall would crack when heated. Too much sand, and it won't hold. He showed her how to mix it, how to apply it, how to lay stone upon stone with a staggered pattern so the joints wouldn't line up. Soyeon caught on instantly. After the 3rd row, she was already doing it without prompting. He was building the chimney. That was the most difficult part. Using stones and clay, he had to run a pipe through the roof of the dugout to the outside. The pipe had to be tall enough to create draft, wide enough not to get clogged with soot, strong enough not to collapse in the wind. He used 4 long poles as a frame. He lined them with stones. He smoothed it with clay. He left it to dry. By noon, the main structure was ready. The firebox, the base, the walls, the chimney, an air vent at the bottom to supply air. But the clay had to dry slowly. If he lit a fire now, while the mortar was still wet, the walls would crack. He told Yuna they had to wait. She asked how long. He replied, until evening. A small fire, very low, so the clay would dry gradually. She nodded. While the stove was drying, he set to work on the second task, the outhouse. It stood 30 paces from the well, further down the slope. This meant that rainwater and melting snow could carry waste toward the well, not directly, but through the soil. Over the past 1.5 years, they had been contaminating the aquifer, slowly but surely. He explained this to Minji because she was nearby and because she was asking the right questions. She listened. Then she asked where to move it. He pointed, to the northwest, behind the hill, down the slope, but on the opposite side from the well and the stream. Minji nodded and organized 4 people with shovels. She herself stood at. He noticed that she worked in silence. She didn't complain. She didn't give orders. She just did it. The other women listened to her, not because she spoke louder, but because she spoke more precisely. By midday, he was sitting by the stove, watching the small fire that was slowly warming the walls. The clay was beginning to change color. It was getting lighter from dark gray, a good sign. There were no cracks. The draft was working. The smoke was rising up the chimney. He let out a sigh of relief. A girl approached him. That very one. Wearing glasses made of polished rock crystal, he remembered. He'd seen her yesterday by the well, skinny, quiet. She sat down next to him and was silent for a long time. Then she asked why the smoke went up and not to the sides. He explained. Hot air is lighter than cold air. It rises. The chimney directs it. The hotter the fire, the stronger the draft. She listened. Then she asked how he knew that. He said again that he had studied it. She asked if he'd read books. He said yes. She asked if he had any books with him. He said no. She looked disappointed. He asked her name. So-hyun. He froze. So. His last name. She noticed his reaction and quickly said that So was a common name in 4 clans and that it didn't mean anything. He nodded. She asked how old he was. He thought for a moment. The body he was wearing looked 25. His real age was 31. He said 31. She was surprised. She said he didn't look it. He shrugged. She said she was 19, that she was from the So clan's archives, that she had been expelled for reading books that women were forbidden to read. He asked what kind of books. She paused. Then she said they were books about construction, about old fortresses, about a man whom the chronicles called Master Nameless. Daniel felt as if something cold stirred in his chest. He didn't know why. There was no reason, just a name, the Nameless Master. But his body reacted before his mind did. He asked who that was. Hyun said he was the man who, 200 years ago, built the first real fortress in Erin, with double walls, with an underground water supply. That he had appeared out of nowhere and vanished, and that the clan he served had slaughtered everyone who had seen his blueprints. He wanted to ask more, but at that moment Yuna called him. It was getting dark. The stove had dried out. It was time. He stacked the firewood in the firebox, dry, chopped into small pieces, wood shavings and bark at the bottom. The air vent was open. He asked for a fire. They gave him a burning splinter. He held it to the shavings. They caught fire. The flame licked the lower kindling. It rose. It engulfed the firewood. He closed the air vent halfway. The smoke rose upward, into the chimney, clean, even, without swirls. The draft worked perfectly. 10 minutes later, the stones in the hearth began to heat up. 20 minutes later, it was warm in the dugout. Not just not cold, but truly warm. The women entered one by one. They paused. They looked at the stove, at the fire behind the stone walls, at the chimney from which smooth white smoke rose outside. The woman who coughed at night was the last to enter, thin, pale. She stood by the stove and held her hands out toward the warmth. She stood there for a long time. Then she sat down on the floor next to the stove, and she didn't cough once. Warm, dry air. The smoke goes outside. It doesn't gather at the bottom. It doesn't eat away at the lungs. Yuna stood at the entrance and watched. Daniel stood by the wall and watched her. He waited. She said 2 words. "You're staying." He nodded. At night he couldn't sleep, not because of the cold. For the first time in 3 days he was warm. The stove was burning steadily. Through the wall of the dugout he heard quiet voices. The women were talking by the stove. Some were laughing. The first laughter he'd heard in this camp. He lay there and thought about tomorrow, about how they needed to build a second stove, in another dugout, then a third, then start rebuilding the palisade, then think about winter. 3 months, maybe less. 42 women, 7 children. 1 winter they all had to survive, every single one of them. He rolled onto his side. Behind the wall, the woman who had been coughing slept quietly, without coughing, for the first time in a long time. That was enough. Today, That was enough. The first week passed like one long day. Daniel built a second stove, then a third. Soyeon helped with each one. By the third, she was already laying the walls on her own. He just checked the joints and adjusted the angle of the chimney. She learned faster than anyone he'd ever worked with. Faster than the students in Seattle. Faster than the construction workers in Oregon. Her hands seemed made for stone. He told her that. She froze. Then she turned away, but he could see her ears had turned red. Work on the stockade was proceeding in parallel. Yuna had assigned 8 people. They worked half-days, just as he had requested. Construction in the morning, hunting, gathering firewood, and guard duty in the afternoon. Daniel was in charge, but his leadership seemed strange. He didn't stand on the sidelines and give orders. He stood nearby and explained. Every action, every step. Why the stones at the bottom? Why the large ones below and the small ones above? Why tamp them down? Why a log is placed not just in a hole, but on a cushion. He explained not because he thought they were stupid, but because he knew that his knowledge would be useless if it remained only with him. If he broke his leg tomorrow, if he got sick, if he were killed, someone had to be able to carry on. Minji kept track. Every stone they brought from the southern hills, every log, every basket of clay. She kept a record on birch bark, lines and dots, her own system. Daniel looked at her records and realized she wasn't just keeping a tally, but a full-fledged inventory. Incoming, outgoing, balance. He asked who had taught her this. She replied that no one had. That in the Pot clan she had worked in the storerooms and seen how the elders falsified the records. That she kept her own, the real ones. That when she tried to show them to the clan chief, she was accused of slander and expelled. She told this in an even voice, without self-pity. But he noticed that her fingers were clenching the birch bark scroll a little tighter than necessary. He said that here, her records would be the only ones, and that no decision regarding the expenditure of materials would be made without her. She looked at him for a long time, then she nodded. By the end of the first week, the southwestern section of the palisade had been rebuilt. 23 logs were removed and set back on stone cushions. The difference was visible to the naked eye. The old sections swayed slightly in the wind, the new ones stood as if cast in place. Daniel began planning the second section, but Yuna stopped him. She said the people were tired, that the hunters were bringing in less game because some of them were working on the construction site, that supplies were dwindling. He sat down and thought. She was right. He had gotten too carried away. The construction was devouring resources, people, time, energy, food. He needed to find a balance. He asked Minji to show him the food records. She did. Grain, not much. Enough for a month if they rationed. Dried meat, enough for 2 weeks. Roots and berries, unpredictable, depended on the weather and how many people could be sent out to gather. Hunting. 4 archers. Yuna is the best of them. They bring back an average of 1 deer a week, sometimes hares. That's not enough. For 42 adults and 7 children, that's not enough. He asked if there was a river nearby with fish. Minji replied that a stream to the northeast flows into a river about an hour's walk away, but no one has any nets. He thought for a moment. A net. He didn't know how to weave nets, but he knew the principle of a fish trap. A woven trap made of twigs, a conical funnel at the entrance. The fish swims inside and can't find its way out. Primitive, but effective. He sketched the design on a piece of bark. He showed it to Soyeon. She looked at it. She thought about it. She said she could weave one out of willow twigs. He said they needed 3, or better yet, 5. She said they'd be ready in 2 days. They were ready in a day and a half. Soyeon enlisted 2 women. They worked in the evening by the light of the campfire. The traps turned out a bit rough, but sturdy. Daniel carried them to the river himself, with the 3 women Yuna had assigned. The river wasn't wide. It was cold, with a rocky bottom. He found a spot where the current slowed near a large rock. He set up the traps. He showed them how to set them. A day later, there were 7 fish in them. Small, but fish nonetheless. 3 days later, 15. Not much, but it was meat they didn't have to hunt for hours. Meat that caught itself while the people were busy with other things. Minji added the fish to her notes. A separate line. A steady income. He saw her nod to herself as she wrote down the numbers. The second week, Daniel started work on the well. The pit higher up the slope had been completely filled in, tamped down, covered with a layer of clay on top so rainwater wouldn't seep back in. Now they had to line the well itself, a clay castle, a layer of rich clay around the log cabin on the outside, as thick as a palm, from the surface down to the depth of the water table. The work was dirty and hard. They had to dig around the well to a depth of 2 human heights, tamp down the clay layer by layer, then fill it back in. He worked with 4 women. They dug in shifts. 2 dug while 2 rested. Daniel dug too, slowly, weaker than they were. His body still wasn't used to it. His muscles tired quickly. His breathing got ragged. One of the women looked at him with something between pity and mockery and said he was digging like a child. He wasn't offended. She was right. But he kept going, because he couldn't ask people to do something he wasn't willing to do himself, even if he did it worse. By the end of the 2nd week, the well was lined. They waited. 3 days. 5 days. On the 7th day, Daniel scooped up some water. He sniffed it. He tasted it. Clean. No iron taste. No cloudiness. Clear. Cold. He brought the bucket to the fire. Yuna was the first to try it. Then Soyeon. Then Minji. Then the woman who had been suffering from stomach pain for a year and a half. She drank a full mug, slowly. She closed her eyes. She didn't say a word. But Daniel understood everything from the look on her face. That evening, it was noisier than usual around the fire. 12 women, then 20. They talked. They argued. But they argued differently. Not about who would go for the rotten water, but about who would be the first to fetch the clean water. Daniel sat off to the side and drew on the bark. The next phase, a woodshed, a simple structure, 4 posts, a roof of poles covered with bark and sod, sloped to one side to drain rainwater. Under the shed, the wood would stay dry. Dry firewood burns hotter and longer. That means less firewood for the same result. That means fewer people needed for gathering. That means more people for construction, or for hunting, or for rest. Every little thing set off a chain reaction. Every improvement freed up resources for the next one. He knew this principle. On the construction site in Oregon, he called it the spiral of efficiency. Here, he didn't call it anything. He just did it. Soyeon sat down next to him. She looked at the sketch. She asked if she could draw an alternative version. He said sure. She took a second piece of bark and drew it. A shelter, but with a side wall on the north side, where the main wind blows from. The wall would protect the firewood from the rain carried by the wind. He looked at it. He thought about it. She was right. His version didn't take the wind direction into account. Hers did. He said her version was better. She stared at him. Then she asked if he was serious. He said he was serious, that she was right, that a windbreak was necessary. She said quietly that no one had ever told her her plan was better before. He said that was because she'd shown it to the wrong people before. She was silent. Then she stood up and left. He saw her wipe her face with the back of her hand, but he didn't look any further. Some things you don't need to see. You just need to know they exist. At the end of the 2nd week, the first problem arose, a real one, not a construction problem. 3 women from the former Cho clan and 2 from the Han clan. A quarrel broke out between them, over the line for the stove in the 3rd dugout. A woman from the Cho clan said that by seniority of blood, she had the right to go first. The woman from the Han clan said there was no more blood in the Cho clan than in a swamp toad. Things escalated quickly. Daniel heard a scream and ran outside. 2 women were standing face to face. One was holding a knife, the other a shovel. Yuna was out hunting. Soyeon froze against the wall of the dugout, her eyes wide open. Minji took a step forward, but stopped. Daniel stood between them. It was foolish. Both were stronger than him. Both could kill him with a single blow. But he stood his ground and said one thing. He said that the stove they shared, he hadn't built it for the clan. He'd built it for this dugout, for everyone who sleeps in it. And that if they maimed each other now, he'd have to take the stove apart and carry the stones out one by one, because he wouldn't build near blood. The woman with the knife looked at him. She looked at the stove, from which steady, warm smoke was rising. She lowered the knife. The other woman lowered her shovel. He stood between them and felt his heart pounding. His hands were shaking, but he didn't back down. That evening, Yuna returned. They had told her. She came to him. She asked if it was true that he had said he would dismantle the stove. He replied that it was. She asked if he would really do it. He replied that he wouldn't. She narrowed her eyes slightly. Then the corner of her mouth twitched. He couldn't say for sure, but it seemed to him that it was a smile, the first he'd ever seen on her face. She said he was lucky they believed him. He replied that he knew. She left. He remained sitting at the entrance to the dugout, thinking about what he'd just done. He'd stood between two armed women and bluffed. In Seattle, he hadn't even played poker. A month. 30 days in Hayren. Daniel marked each one with a notch on the lintel of his dugout. 30 notches. The camp had changed. It was obvious at first glance to anyone who remembered what it used to be like. 3 dugouts stood dry. The drainage ditches were working. The stoves were smoking steadily. 2/3 of the stockade had been rebuilt. A woodshed had been built according to Soyon's blueprints, complete with a windbreak. Underneath lay a week's worth of dry firewood. A new pulley system with a counterweight stood by the well. It was a simple design, but the women no longer had to pull a full bucket up using only the strength of their arms. The counterweight did half the work. Minji took stock of their supplies. The grain was running low, but the fish from the rapids provided a steady source of protein. 4 hunters brought back game. Berries and roots were harvested for the future. They were dried, they were smoked. Minji implemented a system. Every day she recorded how much had been eaten, how much was left, and how much was needed until winter. The numbers were grim, but they were there. For the first time in a year and a half, the exiles knew exactly how long their food would last. That knowledge didn't fill their bellies, but it gave them something to hold on to. Daniel began to think about stone. A palisade is good against wolves and small raiding parties, but it wouldn't survive a real siege. It wouldn't even survive a serious storm. Wood rots, burns, breaks. Stone stands. The southern hills were full of limestone, soft, layered. Not the best, but it would be enough. He thought about a wall, a real stone wall. Not now, it's too early. There are no people, no tools, no mortar. But soon. While he was thinking about the wall, the world reminded him that it existed. One morning in the 4th week, Hyun ran up to him, out of breath. Her glasses had slipped down her nose. She said there was someone on the southern ridge. Yuna was already there. Daniel followed Hyun. They climbed up to the ridge. Yuna stood at the edge with a spear. 2 archers were beside her. Below, on the trail, 4 men were riding on horseback. They wore light leather armor. Each had a mark on his left shoulder. Daniel hadn't seen one like that before. Yuna had. She said one word. Che. Scouts from the Che clan. 4. This isn't a raid. A raid would be 30. These are scouts. Someone sent them to look. Yuna ordered everyone to go behind the palisade, not to show themselves. Daniel asked why. She explained briefly. If the scouts see a fortified camp, they'll report it. If they report it, others will come, more of them. If they see that the camp is weak, they might pass by, or they might not, but the chances are higher. He didn't agree. He said they'd already seen smoke coming from the chimneys. 3 chimneys. That means at least 3 buildings. Steady smoke means the stoves are working well. That's already information. It's too late to hide. Yuna looked at him. He could see she was angry, not at him, at the situation, at the fact that he was right. She asked what he suggested. He suggested showing them exactly as much as necessary. No more, no less. The palisade stands firm. The stoves are smoking. There's a guard at the gate. The camp is alive, not abandoned, not weak, but not threatening either. The scouts will see the settlement. Small, female, with a palisade. They'll report that outcasts live on the outskirts. That's not news. That's not a reason for a raid. A reason for a raid is a wall, a stone wall, a tower, a moat. That means someone is building a fortress, and a fortress on no man's land is a challenge, Yuna thought. Then she nodded. They weren't hiding. Daniel had gone behind the palisade. The scouts didn't need to see his face. A man among the exiles raises questions. Yuna stood at the gate. 4 horsemen rode down the path 300 paces from the camp. One turned his head. He looked. Yuna stood motionless, spear in hand. The horsemen turned away. They rode past. Daniel exhaled. Minji stood next to him behind the wall. She said quietly that it was a patrol, that they come by once every 2 or 3 months, that before they used to ride past without looking, that today one of them looked. That meant next time they'd all be looking. Daniel nodded. He understood. Time. They had time, but he didn't know how much. Maybe a month, maybe 3, maybe until spring. He decided to speed things up. That very evening, he gathered Yuna, Soyeon, Minji, and Haeun around the campfire. The 4 of them. He laid out pieces of bark with drawings on them in front of them, and began to speak. He spoke of a wall. Not a palisade, a real stone wall. 2 men high, 3 cubits thick, with a foundation on a stone base, with buttresses every 20 paces. Yuna listened and said nothing. Soyeon listened and drew. Minji listened and calculated. Haeun listened and took notes. He spoke of a tower. One, the southwestern one, the very one he had mentioned on the first day. The corner tower controls 2 directions. From it, you can see the southern trail and the western slope. Yuna asked why they needed a tower if they didn't have people to defend it. He replied that a tower isn't just for defense. A tower is a sign. A caravan that sees a stockade passes by. A caravan that sees a stone tower stops and thinks. Minji asked how much stone was needed. He answered. She paused. Then she said it would take 3 months of work for the whole camp. He replied that not everyone would be needed, that a quarry was needed, 10 people, a permanent crew. They'll break stone in the southern hills, carry it to the camp. He'll teach them how to break it, how to lay it, how to mix the mortar. Soyeon said she knew how to lay stone, that she'd learned it in the clan, that she needs practice, but she'll manage. He said he knew, that he'd seen it, that she would be in charge of the masonry. She stared at him, then at Yuna. Yuna didn't object. Ha-in asked quietly, "What if the Choi clan arrives before the wall is ready?" Daniel replied that that was exactly why they would start at the west corner, that the wall would grow out from the tower, that even half a wall was better than no wall at all, that even a quarter of a wall with a tower at the corner was already a line that couldn't be bypassed without exposing a flank. Yuna looked at the blueprint, then at him. She asked where he had fought. He replied that he hadn't fought anywhere. She raised an eyebrow. He said he hadn't fought, that he had read, that he had built, that he knew how walls worked because he knew how they were destroyed, that an engineer who builds fortifications must think like the one who will storm them. Otherwise, he will build a beautiful monument rather than a fortress. Yuna looked at him for a long time. Then that in the morning they would start breaking stone. Minji asked who would hunt if 10 people went to the quarry. A fair question. Daniel replied that he had thought about it, that they needed to increase the fish catch, that he would set up 10 more traps if Soyeon and her assistants wove them, that fish would replace some of the meat and free up the hunters, that he also wanted to try snares for hares, simple loops made of sinew on animal trails, passive hunting. It didn't require people, just checks in the morning and evening. Minji nodded. She calculated something on the birch bark. She said that if the nets yielded twice as much fish and the snares caught at least 2 hares a week, then 10 people could be diverted to the stone without any loss in food. Barely, but it was possible. He looked at her and thought she could manage the supplies for a small town, that she already had. Only the town had 42 people and stood on clay. They started the next day. Daniel led 10 women to the southern hills. He showed them how to read the rock, where the crack in the layer was, where you could drive in a wooden wedge, wet it with water, and wait until the wood swelled and split the rock, where you could just strike it and get a smooth block, where you couldn't strike it because the rock would split the wrong way. They listened, some with interest, some with indifference. The work was hard, carrying stones from the hills to the camp, 200 paces, no cart, no horse, in their arms, on their backs, in baskets. Daniel did the math. In a day, 10 women could carry 30 blocks. Each block was 2 fists wide. For one running cubit of a wall twice a man's height, you'd need about 200 blocks. That meant 1 cubit of wall per day. The perimeter he had planned was 300 paces. That's almost a year. Too long. We need a cart. We need a road. We need a system. He lay down that night and couldn't sleep again. He counted. He thought. He recalculated. A cart could be made. Wheels from thick tree stumps. An axle from a pole. Rough but functional. Trample a path from the hills to the camp. Pack it down. Lay poles in the ruts. Primitive rails. He remembered how in Oregon, after a landslide, they laid temporary roads out of logs so heavy machinery wouldn't get stuck. Same principle, only instead of an excavator, 10 women with baskets. He fell asleep with numbers in his head. And he had a dream. The first dream in Hiren that he remembered. He dreamed of a wall, a stone wall, a tall one. People were standing on it, lots of people, women, children. He stood below and looked up, and he couldn't find a single stone in the wall that he had laid himself. All the stones had been laid by other hands, according to his drawings, but by other hands. He woke up. It was still dark. Next to him in his dugout, Hein was quietly sniffling. She had moved here 3 days ago. She said her dugout was too noisy and she needed to read in the evenings. He didn't object. She read by the light of a torch. Birch bark scrolls she'd brought with her from the clan. Records from the archives, chronicles. He fell asleep to the rustling of the birch bark. In the morning, she told him what she had read, snippets, fragments, the history of Hiren recorded in bits and pieces. She told him that the northern outskirts hadn't always been empty, that 200 years ago there had been a settlement here, a small one. It had been destroyed by the Cho clan in alliance with the Han clan. The reason wasn't specified in the chronicles. It simply states that the settlement was deemed a threat and razed to the ground. Daniel asked, what settlement? Hein paused. Then she said that in the chronicle it was named with a single word, the nest, and that next to that word was a symbol she had never seen before, a symbol resembling a drafting square, a builder's tool. He felt that cold stirring in his chest again. Master Nameless, the nest, 200 years ago, here, on this very land. Someone had already tried to build what he was about to build, and they had been wiped out, down to the stone. He was silent all the way to the quarry. He thought. Then he decided that thinking about it now was useless. Right now, he needed stones. A wall. Winter. 42 women who had to survive until spring. The rest could wait. He lifted the first block and carried it to the camp. Heavy. His arms ached. His back ached. But he carried it. 200 steps. He set it down. He went back. He picked up the second one. The first stone was laid in the foundation on the 43rd day. Daniel was kneeling in a trench waist deep, tamping down the gravel bed with his hands. Soyeon stood nearby, holding the first block at the ready. Smooth. Flat. She'd picked it out herself from a pile at the quarry. She said the first stone had to be beautiful. He didn't argue. She placed it on the bed, pressed it down with her palms. The stone settled firmly. It didn't wobble. She looked at Daniel. He nodded. Good. Even. She smiled, quickly, like a flash, and immediately turned away to the next block. The cart they'd built last week had changed everything. Rough. Heavy. Wheels made of oak planks that creaked so loudly you could hear them from half a kilometer away. But it carried as much stone in a single trip as 3 women could carry in a day. The path from the hills to the camp had been packed down and lined with poles in the ruts, primitive rails. The cart rolled along them almost effortlessly. Minji calculated that productivity had quadrupled. She uttered that word. Productivity. Daniel hadn't taught her that word. She had invented it herself. In Aaron, it sounded like the amount of useful work done by hand in a single day. Long-winded, but accurate. The stones were piling up. The foundation of the southwest tower covered an area 4 by 4 paces. The trench was a cubit and a half deep, a gravel bed. The first row of large blocks, mortar between them. Daniel had taught them to make mortar from lime. The limestone was burned in a pit. The simplest method, a pit in the ground, firewood at the bottom, pieces of limestone on top. They lit it and waited 2 days. The stone crumbled into white powder, quicklime. They poured water in carefully because it boiled and sputtered. The result was a lime slurry. We mixed it with sand, 1 part to 3, a mortar that became hard as stone in a week. Soyeon mastered it first, then she taught the others. Daniel watched as she explained and recognized his words, his gestures. She was copying his teaching style, patiently, step by step, without irritation, only faster. She was a better teacher than he was, because she herself had recently been learning and remembered what it was like not to know. The 3rd month brought cold, not winter yet, but the nights became such that it was impossible to be in the dugout without a stove. In the morning, frost on the grass, breath turning to steam. The water in the buckets formed a thin crust by dawn. Daniel was the one who froze the most. His body wasn't adapted to this climate. Thin skin, little fat. The muscles he'd built up over 2 months were still weaker than those of any of the women who'd grown up on the northern outskirts. Hayne brought him a woolen blanket. He asked where it came from. She said she'd traded it with one of the women for 2 candles. He asked where the candles came from. She hesitated. Then she admitted she'd made them herself, from fat and hemp thread. He looked at her in surprise. She shrugged and said she'd read about it in the Chronicle, that the monks of the So clan made candles for the archives, that the recipe was written in the margins of a page she'd been forbidden to read. He wrapped himself in the blanket and thought that this 19-year-old girl with mountain crystal glasses was dangerous. Not physically, intellectually. She absorbed knowledge like dry earth absorbs water, and she applied it faster than he could realize she had absorbed it. The tower's foundation emerged from the ground in the 3rd week of the 3rd month. The first row of the wall above ground, stone upon stone, mortar between them, a buttress on the north side. Daniel checked every row, horizontal, vertical, joint dressing. Soyeon stood beside him and checked after him. Sometimes she found what he had missed, a stone that had been laid slightly crooked, a joint that was thicker than it should be. She corrected it silently. He noticed and nodded. They worked like 2 cogs in a single machine. He designed, she built. They didn't need many words between them. She understood his drawings better than he did sometimes. Once she looked at his sketch of the arch above the future gate and said that the angle of the vault was too steep, that the stone in the keystone would press down rather than out to the sides, and the arch would crack. He recalculated. She was right. He corrected the drawing. She stood nearby and watched as he redrew it. Then she quietly said that in the Khan clan's temple she had seen an arch, a large one, made of stone. She was 14, and she stood beneath it, looking up and thinking she wanted to build one just like it. The master architect saw her gaze and said that a woman cannot lay stone for the gods. She said she just wanted to lay stone, not for the gods, for people. The master laughed and walked away. She fell silent. Daniel was silent too. Then he said she would build that arch herself, that he would draw it and she would build it, and that her mark would be on the keystone. She looked at him. Her eyes were shining. She opened her mouth to say something. Then she closed it. Then she turned and walked toward the quarry. He heard her shout at 2 women along the way who were carrying stones incorrectly, and her voice was clear and lively. By the end of the 3rd month, the tower walls had risen to waist height, a square 4 by 4 paces. The walls were a cubit and a half thick, 2 buttresses on the north and west sides. Inside, the future staircase, a spiral staircase, carved into the thickness of the wall. Daniel explained the principle to Soyeon, and she stared silently at the blueprint for 2 days before saying she understood. Then she began laying the stones, and from the very first one, she placed it perfectly. He stopped being surprised. They began building the wall simultaneously, from the tower to the north and from the tower to the east. 2 beams, slowly, 3 or 4 cubits a day. The mortar took a long time to dry in the cold air. This slowed down the work. Daniel thought about how to speed things up. They needed to shield the fresh masonry from the wind. He came up with portable shields made of poles and hides. They set them up on the windward side. It helped. The mortar dried a day faster. It was, but the little things added up. One evening, Minji came to him with birch bark and said they had a problem. Not with the stone, with food. The fish in the shallows were getting smaller and fewer. The river was getting colder. The fish were moving deeper. The snares yielded 2 or 3 hares a week. Not enough. The hunters were bringing back a deer once every 10 days instead of 7. The game was moving south to escape the cold. Their grain supplies had run out a week ago. She said that if nothing changed, they would start starving in a month. Daniel sat and looked at her numbers. Even, precise, merciless. The numbers didn't lie. He asked if there was anyone nearby they could trade with. Minji replied that 2 days' journey to the southeast was a Han clan trading post. Merchants, caravanners. They sell grain for silver or for goods. The exiles have no silver. He asked what goods they'd take. Minji replied, hides, honey, iron, medicinal herbs. They had hides, a few. The hunters skinned their prey and dried them. But hides were winter clothing. Giving them away meant freezing. No honey, no iron. Herbs. He asked what kind of herbs. Minji listed a few names. He didn't know a single one. But Hein, who had been sitting in the corner listening, suddenly looked up. She said that mountain myrnic grows on the northern slope beyond the stream, that she saw it last week when she went to fetch water, that in the So clan they dried it and sold it for a good price because it reduces fever and treats inflammation. Minji looked at her, then at Daniel. He said that tomorrow they would go gather myrnic. They gathered for 3 days. Hyun showed them where it grew, how to cut it properly so the root remained and the plant would grow back by the next year. She knew this from books, from those very forbidden books. They filled 4 baskets. They dried them on stones by the stove. Minji packed them into birch bark bundles, neatly, carefully. Each bundle was the same size and weight. Daniel asked why such precision was necessary. She replied that a merchant who sees neatly packaged goods pays more, that sloppiness is a discount you give away for free. He nodded and thought that this woman frightened him more than the Cho clan scouts. Minji left for the trading post with 3 women. Yuna wanted to go with them, but Daniel asked her to stay. He said that if Minji were seen with an armed warrior from the Cho clan, it would raise questions. But if 4 women brought dried herbs, it would just look like trade. Yuna disagreed. She said that without weapons, they could be robbed on the way. He replied that with weapons, they could be identified. That Yuna's sword wasn't just a sword. It was a sword of the Cho clan's warrior branch, with a family crest engraved on the hilt. Anyone who knew what they were looking at would see it. Yuna was silent. Then she took the sword from her belt and laid it on the table, for the first time in 3 months. Minji returned 5 days later, with grain, 3 sacks, and with news. At the trading post, she had overheard conversations about the northern outskirts, about the exiles who lived there, about the smoke from chimneys that travelers had seen. Rumors. Just rumors for now, but rumors and heron traveled faster than horses. She said one more thing. There was a man from the Pak clan at the trading post, her former clan. He recognized her. He didn't approach her. He didn't speak to her, but he watched her, and she could see that he was memorizing her. Daniel asked if it was dangerous. Minji replied that she didn't know, that the Pak clan was a trading clan, that they didn't fight, but they sold information to those who did. The silence in the dugout grew thicker. Yuna said the wall needed to be built faster. Daniel replied that faster meant worse, that if they rushed the masonry, the mortar wouldn't set, that a wall that stands for 2 weeks and then falls is worse than no wall at all, because a wall that isn't there doesn't create a false sense of security. Yuna looked at him. He held her gaze. She nodded. She said, "Do as you see fit." He did. Every day, stone by stone, row by row. The wall grew, slowly, steadily, like a tree. You can't pull a tree by the top to make it grow faster. You can only water the roots and wait. Winter came overnight. Daniel went to bed when the temperature was bearable and woke up because he couldn't feel his toes. He went outside. White. Everything was white. The snow lay in a thick layer, as thick as a palm. The wind blew from the north, sharp, biting. He exhaled, and the vapor hung in the air for 3 seconds before dissipating. Construction had stopped. The mortar wouldn't set in the frost. The stone was covered with a crust of ice and wouldn't hold the mortar. Daniel knew this would happen. He had prepared for it. But it was one thing to prepare and another to stand before a wall as high as his chest and realize that the next stone wouldn't be laid for another 4 months. The wall of the southwest section stretched 30 paces north from the tower and 20 to the east. The tower rose to a height just above a man's height, a little, not much. But it was a stone, a real one, and it stood. Winter meant different work, not external, but internal. Daniel switched gears. First, insulating the dugouts. The walls were lined with an extra layer of turf. The cracks in the roofs were caulked with moss and clay. The entrances were covered with double hides, with an air gap between them. He explained the principle. The air between the 2 layers of hides acts as an insulator. It keeps the cold out and the heat in. Soyeon listened and nodded. Then she said that in the temples of the Khan clan, the walls were built double with a gap inside. He smiled. He said it was the same principle. She smiled back, and that smile lasted longer than usual. Second, supplies. Minji kept a daily tally. Grain, dried meat, smoked and dried fish, roots, herbs. She calculated the exact amount of food for each person every day. An adult woman received 1 measure a day, a child 2/3. Daniel received as much as a woman, even though he ate less. Minji said that he worked with his head, and the head eats no less than the hands. He didn't argue. According to her calculations, the supplies would last until midwinter. After that, famine would set in. If the hunting didn't improve, if there were no new supplies. If. So many ifs, Daniel thought. They needed a food source that didn't depend on hunting or the weather. He remembered pickling, cabbage, turnips, root vegetables. In the fall, they had gathered wild parsnips and beets, not bongs. But if pickled in barrels, they wouldn't spoil until spring, and lactic acid provided extra protection against scurvy. He explained this to Minji. She listened. Then she organized it. In 3 days, they dug a pit, lined it with stones and clay, filled it with roots, poured in brine, covered it, sprinkled earth on top for insulation. A primitive cellar, but it worked. Third, people. Winter wasn't just about cold and hunger. Winter was about 42 women and 7 children locked up together in a cramped space for 4 months. The arguments started in the 2nd week. Small ones at first. Who snores? Who takes someone else's spot by the stove? Whose child cries at night? Then bigger ones. The women of the Choi clan believed they were entitled to the best spots because Yuna was the eldest, and Yuna was from the Choi clan. The women of the Han clan believed that Soyeon was doing all the building, so the builders deserved more. The women of the Park clan believed that Minji was feeding everyone, so the merchants were more important. Daniel listened and understood that this wasn't about seats by the hearth. It was about who they were. Each of them carried her clan within her own rules, her own hierarchy. They had left their clans, but the clans hadn't left them. He came up with a simple solution: rotation. Every week, the seats by the hearths would change. Not by seniority, not by clan, by lottery. Stones in a bag. A white stone meant a spot closer to the fire. A gray one meant farther away. No one was to blame. No one chose. It was fate. Yuna looked at him when he suggested it. She said it was silly. He said it was silly, but it worked. She said people would cheat. He said that Minji should conduct the drawing because Minji was the only person in the camp whom everyone trusted when it came to honesty. Yuna thought about it. Then she nodded. The system worked. Not perfectly. There were those who were unhappy. But people unhappy with the draw was better than people unhappy with each other. A small thing. But small things held the camp together. Midwinter. The darkest time. The days were short. The nights endless. The wind howled outside the walls, and snow buried the palisade halfway up. Daniel used the dark hours for teaching. Every evening by the central hearth, he drew on bark and told stories. About explained how mortar works, why water rises up thin tubes against gravity, how to calculate the load on a beam, how to determine the cardinal directions by the stars. The women listened, at first out of boredom, then out of interest. Hein always sat in the front row. She wrote everything down, on birch bark, in small handwriting. She asked questions that made him think. Once she asked why an arch holds more weight than a straight beam. He began to explain about load distribution. She cut him off, said she understood about the load, asked why a semicircle specifically, why not a triangle? He paused, thought. She asked a question to which he had no simple answer. He said that a triangle works too, that a pointed arch is just a triangle with a curve, that a semicircle distributes the load evenly while a triangle concentrates it at 2 points, that uniformity is better for stone. She wrote it down. Then she looked up and said that in the So clan archives there was a description of a structure that had stood for 300 years, with arches that were neither round nor triangular. They were egg-shaped. He froze. An egg-shaped arch. An elliptical one. That meant someone in Heron 300 years ago understood the geometry of the ellipse. He asked where this structure was. She replied that it no longer existed, that the Cho clan had destroyed it 180 years ago. He asked why. She replied that the chronicle stated the structure was too tall. He didn't understand at first. Then he understood. Too tall meant too conspicuous, too skillful, too much like what should not exist in lands where knowledge belongs to the clans. Master Nameless, again. His shadow lay upon this land like a forgotten foundation that still held the ground. Rain appeared in the 3rd week of winter. She didn't come. She was brought in. 2 hunters found her in the snow halfway to the east, unconscious, frostbitten. Her red hair matted with blood, bruises on her body. They carried her into the dugout near the stove. Daniel saw how Yuna looked at her, the gaze of a professional, assessing the injuries. Yuna said her ribs were intact, that the blood was from a cut on her head, but not a deep one, that she had frostbite on her fingers and ears, that she would live. Rain woke up a day later. The first thing she said was in a dialect Daniel didn't understand, then in a second one, then in a third, then finally in Heirin. She asked where she was. Yuna answered. Rain looked around, at the dugout, at the stove, at the women who were looking at her. Then she said they had beautiful stoves and asked who built them. Yuna nodded toward Daniel, who was standing by the wall. Rain looked at him for a long time. Then she said he didn't look like a bricklayer. He replied that he wasn't a bricklayer. She asked who he was. He replied that he was an engineer. She uttered the word slowly, as if tasting it. Then she said she hadn't heard that word before. She was strange. She spoke quickly, jumping from topic to topic. She joked even when she was in pain. She gave everyone nicknames from day one. She called Yoon Stone. She called Soyeon Coal. She called Minji Counting. She called Heian Bookworm. She called Daniel Draftsman. She was a half-blood. Her mother was from the Western clan. Her father was unknown. She was exiled because she belonged to no one. The Western clan considered her an outsider because of her father's blood. Everyone else considered her an outsider because of her mother's blood. She spoke 6 dialects. She translated from one to another instantly. Daniel understood her value right away. If Norin were to grow up, she would need someone who could talk to strangers. Someone who understood not only words, but also what lay behind them. Someone who could sense lies and see hidden meanings. Rain was that person. But she didn't know how to trust. He could see that. Behind the jokes and nicknames stood a wall. Not a stone one, a different kind. She'd gotten used to making people like her in order to survive. Every smile was calculated. Every joke was a test. She watched for reactions and adjusted her behavior instantly. He told her once, when they were sitting by the stove together, that she didn't have to joke with him, that she could just sit there. She looked at him as if he'd hit her, not with anger, with surprise. Then she turned away and remained silent for a long time. It was the first real silence between them, and the first stone in the foundation of something he didn't yet know how to name. The middle of winter was the hardest, not because of the cold. They had grown accustomed to the cold. Not because of hunger. According to Minji's calculations, their supplies would last exactly until the end, barring any unforeseen circumstances. The hardest part was the waiting. The wall stood unfinished. The tower jutted out of the snow like a stump. Every day, Daniel went out and looked at it and counted how much was left. How many rows of masonry, how many stones, how many days until spring when they could lay mortar again. He sketched, every evening, by the light of a torch, on birch bark, on tree bark, on flat stones he dragged into the dugout, a complete plan of the fortress, a wall around the entire perimeter, 4 towers, the gate, the main building, a workshop, warehouses, a well inside the perimeter, a water conduit from a mountain stream, a bathhouse, a refectory, a library. Soyeon sat beside him every evening. She drew her own designs. She argued, sometimes quietly, sometimes loudly. Once they argued past midnight over the shape of the arch above the gate. He wanted a semicircular one. She wanted a pointed one. He argued for strength. She argued for beauty. He said strength was more important. She said that if the arch wasn't beautiful, then what was the point of having a gate at all? They could just leave a hole in the wall. He opened his mouth, closed it. She was technically wrong, but essentially right. A gate is not just an opening for passage. A gate is the face of the fortress, the first thing a visitor sees. And if the face is beautiful, the visitor thinks twice before breaking it down. He said, "All right, pointed, but with my calculations for the thickness." She beamed and began to draw, and her design was better than his. The lines were lighter, the proportions were more precise. She saw the stone not as a material, but as a form. He saw the load-bearing capacity. She saw the beauty. Together, they saw everything. Rain recovered quickly. Within a week, she was walking. After 2 weeks, she was talking to everyone. After 3, she knew every woman in the camp by name and remembered which clan each belonged to, who was feuding with whom, and why. She gathered information the way Minji gathered numbers, systematically, thoroughly, with a specific purpose. Daniel asked her why. She replied that to survive, you need to know who surrounds you. He said she didn't need to survive here. She looked at him with an expression he couldn't read and replied that you have to survive everywhere. He didn't argue. She wasn't ready. Not yet. One night he couldn't sleep. He got up, went outside. The cold stung his face. The sky was clear. The stars shone large and bright. He had never seen stars like these in his life. Not in Seattle, not in Oregon, not anywhere else. These were different stars, different constellations, a different sky. He stood there looking up and felt that emptiness he usually kept at a distance. He was alone, truly alone, in a world where nothing from his past life existed. Not a single familiar face, not a single familiar street, not a single book he could open to find the answer to his question. All he had was what fit inside his head, and sometimes his head seemed too small for what he was trying to do. Snow crunched behind him. Hyun, buried up to her nose in a woolen blanket, her glasses glistened in the starlight. She stood beside him, silently. They stood and looked at the sky. Then she said that the third star to the left of the big bright one was called the Builder's Eye, that the chronicles of the So clan said that the nameless master looked at it every night, that it was his guide. Daniel looked at that star. Ordinary, slightly bluish. He asked why he needed a guide in the sky. Haynes said she didn't know, that the chronicle only said he looked. She paused. Then she said that maybe he, too, felt lonely, and looked at the star to remind himself that there was something constant. He looked at her. 19 years old, rock crystal glasses, hands that trembled from the cold but which she didn't hide because she was holding a birch bark scroll even here, even at night. He said he wasn't lonely. She said quietly that she hadn't asked. He smiled. They returned to the dugout. She lay down on her mat, he on his. She said into the darkness that she was glad he was there. He replied that he was too. In the morning, he returned to work. Winter work was different. Not stone, wood. He designed the interior structures, roof trusses, floors, stairs, doors, window frames, shutters, all made of wood that could be prepared in the warmth under a canopy. The women hewed logs and cut the beams to size. Daniel demonstrated the joints: tongue and groove, dovetail, half-lap joint, simple but sturdy. Not a single nail, because there were no nails. Iron was found only in arrowheads and a few knives. He thought about iron, about the forge, about how without metal the fortress would remain wooden and stone, without hinges, without staples, without bolts, without tools. Without iron, it was impossible to build anything substantial. He shared this with Yuna. She listened. Then she said there was iron, in the ground, on the northwestern slope beyond the stream. She had seen outcrops of ore while hunting in the fall. Brown stone, heavy. She didn't know it was ore. He asked her to show him. They went together. The snow was knee-deep. It was hard going. Yuna walked ahead, clearing a path. He followed her and thought she moved through the snow like through water, lightly, powerfully, without wasted motion, every step precise. She had spent her whole life in the mountains and snow. Her body was made for this, but his body stumbled every 10 steps. On the northwestern slope, he saw ore, brown iron ore, limonite. Not the best ore, but common and suitable for the simplest smelting. He knew the theory: a blast furnace, a pit in the ground, clay walls, bellows for supplying air, coal. You layer the ore and coal. You blow air through the bellows. The temperature rises. Iron flows out of the ore and collects at the bottom as pig iron, a rough, shapeless mass that must later be forged. He knew the theory. He had no practical experience. He had never smelted iron, never forged it. He was an engineer, not a blacksmith. But theory was better than nothing. He told Yuna. She listened. Then she said she needed to think it over, that mining ore wasn't like gathering firewood. It was hard work, people, labor, time, everything they lacked. He agreed, said it was for the spring. Not now. Now was for planning. Do it in the spring. They walked back, Yuna in front, he behind. Halfway there, she stopped. He approached. She stood and looked down at the camp from above. From here, the entire perimeter was visible: the palisade, the dugouts, smoke from the chimneys, the unfinished tower, the wall, women moving between the buildings like ants. She said that a month ago, from here, you could see 3 holes in the ground and a crooked fence. He said nothing. She turned to him. He waited. She said she wanted the tower to be hers. He didn't understand at first. She explained. The southwest tower. She would stand on it. She would defend it. She wanted it to be her tower. He looked at her and saw that she wasn't saying this as an order. She was asking. Cho Yuna, who had never asked anyone for anything, stood before him in the snow and asked for the tower. He said the tower was hers, that he was building it for Yuna, who would stand on it, that it was up to Yuna to decide where the battlements would go, which side the staircase would be on, where the supply of arrows would be kept, because the one who defends the wall knows the wall better than the one who designs it. She was silent for a long time. Then she said one word. Thank you. They walked on, in silence. But the silence was different than before. Spring came slowly. First, drops from the roofs, then patches of thaw near the southern walls. Then the stream swelled and roared. The snow melted unevenly. The mud was ankle deep. Daniel didn't wait. On the first day the temperature rose above 0, he went out to the wall. The mortar. He had to check it. He examined every joint, every block, every buttress. Winter had taken its toll on the masonry. In 3 places, the mortar had crumbled away. Water had seeped into the cracks, frozen and expanded. 2 blocks had shifted by a finger's width. One had cracked. He showed So-yeon. She turned pale. She asked if it was her fault. He replied that it wasn't. that it was physics, that water expands when it freezes and puts pressure on the stone, that they should have covered the wall before winter, that he hadn't thought of that, and that was his mistake. She looked at him strangely. Then she said it was the first time she'd heard a man admit he'd made a mistake. He shrugged. He said mistakes were normal, that what mattered was seeing them and fixing them, that a wall that had survived the winter with 3 cracks was a good wall. They repaired it in 3 days. They knocked out the damaged blocks, replaced them, refilled the gaps with mortar, and covered the masonry on top with stone slabs with an overhang so that rainwater would run off outward and not inward. A cornice. Simple but effective. Construction resumed. But now it was moving faster. Hundreds of blocks had been prepared over the winter. Wooden scaffolding had been erected. Dry mortar was mixed and stored in birch bark sacks. Minji calculated that the material supplies would last for 2 weeks of continuous masonry work. Daniel organized 2 crews. The first laid the wall. The second quarried stone, a continuous conveyor belt. Soyeon supervised the masonry. He walked between the crews, checking and making corrections. The cart creaked along the wooden road from the quarry to the wall, back and forth, back and forth. 6 trips a day. The tower grew, row by row. By the end of the first week of spring, it had risen another 2 rows. Now it was a head taller than a man. Inside, the spiral staircase was already long enough to climb 1.5 turns. Daniel climbed up. He stood on the top landing. He looked around. From here, he could see the southern trail all the way to the horizon, the western slope, the forest to the east, the stream to the northeast. He stood there and felt the wind, and for a second, he allowed himself to see what would be. A wall around the entire perimeter, 4 towers at the corners, houses inside, streets, a square, people. He blinked and the vision vanished, only the wind and stone, and work. At the end of the second week, what he had been waiting for and fearing happened. People came from the south, not scouts on horseback, on foot. A woman and 2 children, thin, dirty, with empty eyes. The guards spotted them on the trail half a kilometer away. Yuna stepped out through the gate. Daniel stood on the wall and watched. The woman fell to her knees before Yuna. The children stood nearby, a boy of about 6, a girl of about 3. Yuna helped the woman up, led her inside. Daniel climbed down. The woman's name was Lee Na-yeon. She had been expelled from the Lee clan for giving birth to a daughter out of wedlock. With her was a son from her first husband, who had died 2 years ago. She had been walking for 3 weeks. She slept in the woods. She ate roots. She heard from a passing merchant that women were building a house on the northern outskirts. She came on the word house. Minji counted the supplies. 3 new mouths to feed. 2 of them were children. The numbers got worse. But Minji didn't say a word against it. She simply wrote 3 new lines on the birch bark scroll. 2 days later, 2 more arrived. Sisters, young, from the Chong clan. The reason for their exile was the same as that of half the women here: refusal to accept a husband chosen by the elders. They came together, holding hands. Daniel looked at them and thought, 42 had become 47. Soon it will be 50, then 60. Every new woman is a mouth to feed, hands that can work, but also a conflict that could flare up, and a place that needs to be allocated, and a story that needs to be heard. He told Yuna that they needed an intake system. She asked what he meant. He explained. Every new woman who arrives must go through 3 stages. First, Rain talks to her. She finds out where she's from, why she came, and what she can do. Not an interrogation, but an introduction. Rain knows how to talk so that the person tells him everything on their own. Second, Minji determines what kind of work she is capable of and registers her. Third, Yuna decides whether to accept her or not. Yuna listened. Then she said it sounded reasonable. Then she asked, "What if a man comes?" Daniel remained silent, not because he hadn't thought about it, because he had thought about it and hadn't found an answer. Yuna said they wouldn't accept a man. He asked why. She answered briefly. because every woman here had run away from a man, and if a second man appeared within these walls, it would change everything. He wanted to object. He wanted to say that it wasn't fair, that a man could also be exiled and could also be hungry. But he looked at Yuna, at her eyes, at the scar on her eyebrow that she'd gotten from a man in a fair fight, and he remained silent. Not because he agreed, because he realized it wasn't his decision. He was a guest here. He was here because they had let him in. The wall was growing. By the end of the first month of spring, the southwestern section was ready. From the tower to the northern corner, 30 paces of a wall, 1.5 times a man's height. From the tower to the eastern corner, 20 paces. The tower had risen to its full height, 3 flights of stairs. The top platform was crenellated, a real watchtower. Yuna climbed up first. She stood on the platform. The wind ruffled her hair. She stood and looked around. For a long time, Daniel stood below and watched her. Then he turned away. This was her moment, not his. Work began on smelting iron. Daniel built a blast furnace based on the theory he had in his head. Clay walls, bellows made from goat skins that one of the women had sewn. They burned birch charcoal. They crushed the ore with stones and washed it in the stream. The first smelting failed. The temperature wasn't high enough. The ore didn't melt. It remained a black mass at the bottom of the furnace. Daniel looked at it and felt himself sinking inside. He knew the theory, but theory is not practice. Between the formula and the fire lay a chasm he couldn't bridge with knowledge. He needed a blacksmith, a man who feels the heat in his hands, who knows when to blow harder and when to ease up, who hears the fire breathe. He didn't know how to do that. The second smelting went better. He made the furnace taller, added a second bellows, blowed longer, hotter. A lump formed at the bottom of the furnace, shapeless, heavy, porous. A lump. Iron. Dirty, brittle, but iron. He pulled it out with tongs he'd made from 2 sticks with stones at the ends. He placed it on a flat stone. He struck it with another stone. The lump split into 3 pieces. Bad. Too much slag inside. It needs to be forged. He needs a hammer. He needs an anvil. He needs a forge. He needs a blacksmith. He gathered the pieces and carried them back to camp. He showed them to Yuna. She took a piece in her hand, turned it over, looked at it, said it wasn't iron, it was junk. He replied that it was a start, that the first pancake always comes out lumpy. She asked what a pancake was. He didn't bother to explain. Kat arrived in mid-spring. They heard her before they saw her. A knock, rhythmic, heavy, as if someone were striking a rock with a hammer behind the eastern hill. Yuna sent 2 archers. They returned an hour later with a woman who was a head taller than any of them. Broad shoulders, hands like a blacksmith's, because she was a blacksmith. Kathleen O'Dare, Kat, 28 years old, from a distant northern clan where women traditionally worked with metal. She carried a bag of tools on her back, a hammer, pliers, a small anvil, a set of 6 chisels of various sizes, and a leather apron scorched in a dozen places. She had come alone. She'd walked 4 days across the pass. She'd been cast out for refusing to forge arrowheads with which her clan intended to kill people from a neighboring settlement. She said this calmly, like a fact. Then she looked at the unfinished wall and asked who was building it. They pointed to Daniel. She walked over. She looked down at him. She was a head taller than him. He felt small. She asked if he had built the wall. He replied that he hadn't done it alone. She looked at the wall, at the masonry, at the mortar, at the buttresses. Then she said the masonry was good. The stone was poor. She explained, limestone is soft, it crumbles, it absorbs water. In 5 years, the bottom courses will start to crumble if they aren't protected from moisture. Daniel knew that. He had planned to clad the lower courses with harder stone when he found it. But she said it so confidently and precisely that he understood. She knew stone. Not like him, not theoretically, but with her hands. She knew the materials because she had worked with them every day her whole life. He led her to the smelting furnace, showed her the slag. She took a piece. She touched it, tapped it with her fingernail, sniffed it. Then she laughed, loudly, heartily. The echo rolled across the hills. She said it wasn't krite, it was slag with specks of iron, that he'd done everything wrong. The furnace was too small, the bellows were too weak. He used birch charcoal, but he needed hardwood. The loading was wrong. She listed the mistakes, counting them on her fingers, and ran out of fingers. Daniel stood and listened. He felt ashamed, and at the same time, joyful, because standing before him was a person who could do what he could not. She could turn ore into iron, and iron into a tool, and a tool into the ability to build twice as fast and twice as strong. He told her that, straight out, no beating around the bush, that he was an engineer, not a blacksmith, that he knew what a gate hinge should look like, but didn't know if it could be forged, that he needed her. She looked at him. Then she said he should show her a drawing of the hinge. That same evening, he brought the drawing. She unfolded the birch bark. She looked at it for a long time. She ran her finger along the lines. Then she said it could be forged. But she needed a smithy, a real one, not a hole in the ground, a forge, a bigger anvil, bigger bellows, a shelter from rain and wind, and coal, lots of coal. He said he'd already set aside a spot for the smithy in the plan, on the east side, far from the living dugouts so the smoke and heat wouldn't get in the way. She nodded. Then she slapped him on the back. He coughed. She didn't notice. Building the smithy took a week. Daniel designed it. Kat made corrections. He drew the forge on the bark. She crossed it out and drew her own. He calculated the dimensions of the canopy. She said it needed to be wider. They argued. Often. Loudly. She argued like a hammer striking an anvil, straight, with force, without beating around the bush. He was getting used to it. The bellows were built from stone and clay, tall, with double bellows that could work in shifts so the air flowed continuously. Kat brought her own anvil, small but real, steel. She set it on an oak log and stroked it as if it were alive. Daniel saw this and thought that for Kat, the anvil was as the drafting table in his Seattle apartment was to him, the center of the world. The first real smelting took place under Kat's guidance. She completely redesigned his furnace, deeper, narrower, with 3 loading levels, oak charcoal instead of birch, the ore crushed finer, washed more thoroughly. She pumped the bellows herself, rhythmically, hard. An hour, 2, 3. Daniel offered to help. She looked at his hands and said he'd tear the bellows. He wasn't offended. 4 hours later, she opened the furnace. At the bottom lay a lump of iron, real, solid, heavy. She pulled it out with tongs, placed it on the anvil, took the hammer, and struck. The sound echoed through the camp, clear, ringing, metal on metal. She struck. Forged. She turned it over, heated it again in the furnace, struck it again. Slag flew off in sparks. The iron was purified with every blow. An hour later, she held a strip of iron in her tongs, as long as her forearm and as thick as her finger. Smooth, clean. She handed it to Daniel. He took it, still warm, heavy, smooth, real iron. He turned it over in his hands. Then he said that 4 nails could be made from this strip, or 2 hooks, or 1 hinge. Kat said she would make a hinge, that very one, for the gate. He smiled. She smiled. Then she slapped him on the back. He coughed again. She didn't notice again. The forge changed everything. Iron flowed in a thin but steady stream. Nails, staples, hinges, hooks, tooltips. Kat forged from morning till night. Sparks flew from under the canopy, and the women gave the smithy a wide berth because Kat worked like a woman possessed, and it wasn't safe to approach her when she was at the forge. Soyeon came in once to ask about staples for the rafters. Kat didn't hear her. Soyeon touched her on the shoulder. Kat spun around with a hammer in her hand. Soyeon jumped back. Kat saw who it was and burst out laughing. Then she gave her 10 staples and told her to shout from a distance next time. The iron tools sped up the construction. Chisels for working stone, wedges for splitting blocks, axes for hewing wood. Every new tool multiplied their strength. 1 woman with an iron chisel did as much in a day as 3 with stone ones. Minji did the math. Productivity had tripled. She wrote it down on birch bark. Then she looked at the number, then at Daniel. Then she said quietly that if things continued this way, by fall they would have a complete perimeter. He said that if things continued this way. She nodded. If. Late spring. Norin. Rain spoke that name. She sat on the wall watching the sunset, the wind ruffling her red hair. Down below, Hain was passing by with a birch bark scroll. Rain called down to her that this place should have a name. Hain stopped. She looked up. She asked what it should be. Rain thought for a moment. Then she said, Norin, the one who stands in the wind. Hain wrote it down. That evening, by the campfire, Rain said the name in front of everyone. Yuna looked at her, then at the wall, then at the tower, then at the women sitting around the fire. 48 people, 6 more than at the start. Yuna said it was a good name. Soyeon said she would carve it into the keystone of the arch. Minji said she would write it in the header of the ledger. Hyun said she had already written it down. Ket said she would forge it onto the first hinge of the main gate. Daniel was silent. He sat and watched the fire and listened as the women spoke the word. Norin. Norin. It sounded like stone striking stone, like the blow of a hammer, like the wind in the tower. Rain looked at him across the fire and asked why he was silent. He said he was listening. She tilted her head. Then she said quietly that he was strange, that any man in his place would have already named this place after himself. He replied that this wasn't his place, that he was here because they'd let him in. She looked at him for a long time. Then she turned away, and he saw her quickly run her hand over her eyes. But he didn't ask. Some things you just have to see and let go. Chapter Summary. Kat came to Norn with her blacksmithing tools and, in a week, built a real forge that began producing iron. The iron tools tripled the speed of construction. Rain named the fortress Norin, and everyone accepted the name by the evening bonfire. Summer brought heat and people. Norin grew. Every week someone arrived. A woman with a child, 2 sisters, an old woman who could barely walk but carried a sack of seeds on her back. Rain greeted each one, talked to them, found out their stories. Minji registered them. Yuna welcomed them. She never turned anyone away. By the start of summer, 63 people were living in Norin. 11 of them were children. Daniel reviewed the plan every week. The dugouts were no longer enough. They needed houses, real ones, stone ones, with roofs, with windows, with doors on iron hinges that Kat forged. He started with the first house on the inner side of the western wall. The wall also served as the back wall of the house, a dual function, saving stone, saving labor. Soyeon understood the idea instantly. She said that in the Han clan, temple annexes were built the same way. The temple wall was the wall of the dwelling. He nodded. She no longer waited for his approval. She simply built. The first house was ready in 2 weeks. 4 walls, a roof on timber rafters, fired clay tiles, a stove in the corner, a door, 2 windows with shutters, a floor packed down and paved with flat stones. A woman with 3 children who had arrived a month ago moved in. She stepped inside. She paused. She touched the wall. She looked at the stove, at the window through which light streamed in. She sat down on the floor and covered her face with her hands. Her shoulders were shaking. The children stood nearby, not understanding. Daniel stood by the door and didn't go in. Soyeon stood next to him. She didn't go in either. Some doors you have to open and then walk away. The second house, the third, the fourth. Each one faster than the last. Soyeon trained a crew of 8 women. They built the walls on their own. She just checked on them. Daniel drew and calculated. By midsummer, 6 houses stood on the west side. On the east side, they began laying the foundation for 4 more. A space formed between them, not a street yet, but a direction, a path from the gate to the tower. Daniel looked at that space and saw a street. Norin's first street. He told Rain. She looked. Then she said the street needed a name. He said it wasn't up to him to name it. She said it wasn't up to her either, that those who lived on it should decide. That evening, the women from the west side gathered and argued for an hour. Then they named the street First. Just First. Daniel thought that was right. At the same time, the work he'd been planning all winter was underway, the water channel. A mountain stream in the northeast provided clean, cold water, but it was 300 paces from Norin. Carrying water in buckets every day for 60 people meant 4 hours of work for 2 people. Every day. A senseless waste. The aqueduct solved the problem, a channel made of stone and clay, with a slope of 3 fingers for every 10 paces, from the stream to the fortress, inside the fortress into a stone reservoir. From there, through clay pipes to the well and to the bathhouse he hadn't built yet but had already sketched out. 300 paces to the well. That was a lot. That was a very long way. But Daniel knew something about aqueducts that no one in Hayren knew. He knew that water flows on its own. That was a lot. That was a very long way. But Daniel knew something about aqueducts that no one in Hayren knew. He knew that water flows on its own, that it needs no force, no hands. All it needed was the right slope, and once built, the aqueduct would work forever, effortlessly, without people. Water would flow into the fortress day and night, winter and summer, as long as the stones stood. He explained this to everyone by the evening fire. He drew it on a piece of bark. He showed how the water would flow from the stream down the channel, through the wall, into the reservoir. The women listened, some with skepticism. Water can't flow uphill. He said it wouldn't, that the stream was 20 cubits higher than Norin, that the water would flow down, always down, just through the canal, not along the ground. Kane sat in the front row as always. She raised her hand and asked what would happen if the canal froze in winter. He replied that this was precisely why the canal would be buried 2 cubits deep in the ground, below the frost line. The water inside won't freeze. She took notes. Then she looked up and said that the Chronicles of Master Nameless describe an underground aqueduct, that he had brought water to the fortress he was building 200 years ago, that the length of that aqueduct was 10 times greater than what Daniel was planning. Silence. Everyone looked at Hayne, then at Daniel. He felt that cold stirring again. Master Nameless built here, on this land, and his aqueduct was 10 times longer. He was the best engineer, or he had more people, or more time, or all of the above. And he was wiped out anyway. He pushed that thought away. Not now. Work on the aqueduct began the next day. 20 people dug a trench. Soyeon and her crew laid a stone channel at the bottom. Kat forged iron clamps for the joints. Minji calculated material usage and adjusted the schedule so that house construction wouldn't stop. Daniel ran back and forth between the aqueduct and the construction site 6 times a day. He checked the aqueduct's slope with a wooden frame and a plumb line, the simplest level. 2 blocks joined at a right angle, a rope with a stone. If the rope hangs parallel to the vertical block, then the horizontal block is horizontal. If the horizontal block is raised 3 fingers width from one end to the other, then the slope is correct. Primitive, but accurate. 20 days. The water conduit was ready. 300 steps of stone channel, buried deep in the ground, lined with clay on the inside to make it watertight, with stone covers on top to keep out the dirt. From the stream to the reservoir inside Norin. Daniel stood at the upper end. Next to him were Soyeon, Yuna, and Minji. Hyun, Rain, Kat, everyone. He nodded. Soyeon removed the stone flap at the entrance to the channel. Water from the stream gushed into the channel. It ran over the stones. It disappeared underground. They ran down the slope along the channel. The water ran faster than they did. They hadn't made it to the fortress when a stream gushed from the end of the canal inside the walls. Clear, cold. It struck the stone reservoir and began to fill it. The women stood and watched. The water flowed on its own, without buckets, without hands, without effort. It just flowed. Someone laughed, then someone else. Then Kat burst out laughing and slapped the woman next to her on the back so hard she nearly fell into the reservoir. Daniel stood and watched the water and felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Pride. Not for himself, for them. For the 20 people who had been digging the trench for 3 weeks. For Soyeon, who laid the channel and cursed when the stones didn't fit. For Kat, who forged 40 clamps and fitted each one by hand. For Minji, who calculated that if they transferred 2 workers from the houses to the water conduit, the houses would be delayed by 3 days, but the water conduit would be finished 5 days earlier, saving 12 working days. He wasn't proud of himself. He was proud that his drawing had become stone, that the line of charcoal on the bark had become water flowing through the wall. Soyeon approached him, wet. She scooped water from the reservoir and poured it over her head. Summer. Heat. She stood before him with wet hair and a wet shirt and shining eyes. She said she wanted to build a bathhouse. He said the bathhouse was next on the plan. She said she knew, that she had read his drawings. That was all. She fell silent. Then she said she wanted to tell him something. He waited. She opened her mouth. At that moment, a scream rang out from behind the wall, loud, alarming. The sentry in the tower was screaming. From the south, horsemen, many. Daniel ran to the wall. He climbed up to the platform next to Yuna. She was already standing there with a bow, watching. A detachment was moving along the path from the south. Not 4 like last time, 20, on horseback, armed. A banner on a pole. Not Chue, Han, the Han clan. They were heading for Norin. Yuna said this wasn't a raid. Raids don't march under a banner. It's a diplomatic mission, or an ultimatum. Rain climbed onto the wall. She looked. She squinted. Then she said quietly that among the horsemen was a man she knew, the elder of the Han clan, Han Taegyu. He had come for Soyeon. 20 horsemen stopped 100 paces from the gate. The Han clan's banner hung limply in the windless air, heavy, blue with gold. Yuna stood on the wall. Daniel stood behind her, Rain between them. Down by the gate, Soyeon stood as white as the wall she herself had built. Her hands were clenched into fists. A piece of charcoal behind her ear, as always, but her fingers were trembling. Elder Han Taegyu rode forward. Not young, broad-shouldered, silver in his hair, a strong voice, accustomed to giving orders. He addressed the wall, not to Yuna, to the wall. He said he had come for his own, that Han Soyeon had been expelled from the clan by mistake, that the elders had reconsidered their decision, that she was forgiven, that with him was the man she was to marry. A second horseman rode out of the ranks, young, handsome in that smooth, meaningless way that people who have never been told no tend to be. Rain quietly told Daniel that the clan's forgiveness was not mercy. It was a leash, that if Soyeon returned, she would never leave her husband's house again, that forgiveness meant belonging, forever. Daniel looked. Soyeon was standing at the gate. She didn't move. He climbed down from the wall, went out to her, stood beside her. Not in front of her, beside her. She looked at him. There was fear in her eyes. Not the kind she'd had when she came to Norin. A different one. Deeper. Older. The fear she had lived with as a 14-year-old girl under the temple arch when the master said a woman could not lay a stone. The elder saw Daniel. His face changed. He hadn't expected a man. Rain came down to the gate. She stood beside him. Rain spoke first, in the dialect of the Khan clan, fluently, without an accent. She said that Norin welcomed the Khan clan's embassy, that the guests could enter unarmed, that they would be offered water and food, that the conversation would be conducted according to the rules of hospitality. The elder looked at her. He hadn't expected a red-haired half-breed to speak his dialect. He paused. Then he dismounted. His men remained in the saddles. He entered the gate alone. He passed under the arch that Soyeon had designed and built with her own hands, and on keystone of which stood the Soyeon symbol. He did not look up. Rain led him across the street, past the houses, past the smithy from which heat and clanging came because Kat had not stopped working for a second, past the cistern from which water flowed, past the women who stood at the doors and watched in silence, to the plaza in front of the tower. Yuna climbed down from the wall. She stood in front of the elder. He looked at her and recognized her. His ally's niece, Che Yuna. His face hardened. Yuna said that he was a guest, and that no harm would come to a guest here, but that Soyeon was a citizen of Norin, and that the decision regarding her was Soyeon's to make. The elder turned to Soyeon. He spoke softly. He called her a girl. He said that she couldn't live here, that she had no husband here, no home, no name, that she needed to return, that the clan had forgiven her, that everything would be all right. Daniel stood behind Soyeon. He was silent. He waited. Soyeon was silent. He saw her shoulders tremble. He saw her swallow. He saw her fingers clench and unclench. He could have spoken up. He could have spoken for her. But he didn't, because this was her moment, not his. Soyeon remained silent for another 5 seconds. Then she turned to Daniel. He saw a question in her eyes. Not permission, a question. He understood. He slowly pulled a rolled-up blueprint from his bosom. That very one, the main arch. He unfolded it. He handed it to Soyeon. She took it. Her hands stopped trembling. She turned to the elder, unfolded the drawing in front of him, and began to speak. She said that it was an arch, that she had drawn it, that her mark was in the lower right corner, that the keystone of the gate he had just passed through bore the same symbol, that she had built this house, that she had a name, that it was carved in stone above his head. The elder slowly raised his eyes. He looked at the arch, at the stone, at the symbol. Then he looked at Soyeon, and on his face, Daniel saw what he had seen many times on construction sites when a client first entered a building he had thought impossible. The elder was silent for a long time. Then he turned toward the gate. He walked back. He mounted his horse. His party turned around. They rode away, without Soyeon. The wagon train left empty. Soyeon stood at the gate and watched them ride away. The blueprint was pressed to her chest. Then she began to cry, quietly, silently. Tears streamed down her cheeks and dripped onto the birch bark with the drawing of the arch. Daniel stood beside her. He didn't touch her. He didn't speak. He just stood there. She cried and held the drawing, and these were not tears of grief. These were the tears of a person who, for the first time in her life, had said no, and the world hadn't come crashing down. Rain stood a little way off. Her face was inscrutable. But Daniel noticed that she turned away when Soyeon began to cry, and her shoulders rose slightly, as if she had held her breath, or as if she, too, wanted to cry, but couldn't, because she didn't know how. It was quiet by the fire that evening, not the silence of fear, the silence that follows. The women sat and watched the fire, each thinking of her own clan, of the people who might come for them, of the words they would say when that happened. Yuna sat next to Daniel. She was silent. Then she said that Elder Han would return. Not tomorrow, not in a month, but he would return. And next time he would come not with 20 horsemen, but with 200. Daniel nodded. He knew. He said that by then the wall would be complete along the entire perimeter. Yuna said the wall wouldn't stop 200 horsemen. He said the wall wasn't supposed to. The wall was supposed to make an assault costly. So costly that the price would outweigh the benefit, so that the clan chief would look at the wall, calculate how many men he'd lose, and decide that it was cheaper to negotiate. Yuna looked at him. Then she said he was thinking like a general. He replied that he wasn't, that he was thinking like an engineer, that an engineer and a general think alike. Only an engineer counts stones, and a general counts people. Yuna tilted her head slightly. It was her gesture when she heard something that made her think. Then she stood up and left. And once again, he didn't understand the cup of tea she had left next to him. Warm. Autumn of the second year. Norin was unrecognizable. The wall closed around the entire perimeter on the 93rd day of summer. Soyeon laid the last stone. She stood on the scaffolding, holding the block with both hands, while the women below looked up. She set it down, pressed it in. Mortar oozed out at the edges. She smoothed it with her fingers. She stood up. And the silence that had hung below erupted into a shout. Not a battle cry, a joyful one. The wall stood. A full circle. 320 paces. 2 human heights high. 3 cubits thick. 14 buttresses. The southwest tower was complete. The northeast one was laid out, the gate with Soyeon's arch. Inside, 12 houses, a street, a square, a smithy, a reservoir, a water conduit, a well, a bathhouse that Soyeon had designed herself and of which she was prouder than of the arch. 120 residents, of them 23 children, 14 families, 29 single women, 1 engineer. Minji knew every number. She now kept not a birch bark scroll, but a thick book of sewn sheets that Hain made from thin leather, a record of everything: people, food, stone, wood, iron, water, firewood, candles, hides, grain, fish, meat, herbs. Every line, every day. Minji said that Norin was self-sufficient for 8 out of 12 months. The remaining 4 were covered by trade with the way station. Dried herbs, leather goods, forged nails and staples that Cat made in excess of their internal needs. Iron was highly valued. Each batch of nails brought in a week's worth of grain. Minji was a tough negotiator. Daniel went with her once and saw how she looked at a merchant who offered a low price. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't argue. She simply stated her price and remained silent. The merchant was nervous. She wasn't. He gave in. On the way back, Daniel said she bargained like a wall. She asked what that meant. He replied that a wall doesn't budge. She smiled slightly. The first smile he'd ever seen from her. Warm, fleeting, hidden as she turned her head. He ungot her tower, the top room of the southwest tower. Yuna gave her the room above the guard platform. Daniel built the shelves. He carved grooves into the stone walls. He inserted wooden planks. He adjusted them exactly to Hyun's height so she wouldn't have to reach for the top shelf. She noticed it on the very first day. She walked over to the shelf. She reached out, her fingers right on the edge. She turned to him. He was standing by the door. She said quietly that he had made the shelf to her height. He said, of course, that the shelf was to her height. She took off her glasses, wiped them with the hem of her shirt, put them back on. Her eyes were shining. She said that no one had ever made anything to her height before, that in the So Clan archives, the shelves were high because the archivists were men and tall, that she had been reaching up her whole life. He replied that now she didn't have to. She turned back to the shelf and began arranging the birch bark scrolls. He left. It was quiet behind him, but he knew that she was crying, and he knew these were the right kind of tears. Autumn brought unease. Rain returned from the trading post with news. The council of the great clans discussed Norin, officially for the first time. The name was spoken at the council. Rain said that this was both good and bad. Good because a name means existence. If the council spoke the name, it meant Norin existed. Bad because existence without recognition is a threat. The council discussed non-recognition. The council discussed what to do. Yuna listened. Then she said, "We need to prepare." Daniel agreed. He began work on the inner defenses, not just the walls, a moat in front of the wall. Not deep, 2 cubits, but deep enough that a horseman couldn't ride right up to it. Sharp stakes at the bottom. A drawbridge at the gate on chains that Cat had forged. A stockpile of stones on the walls to be thrown down. Barrels of water in case of fire. A supply of arrows. Cat forged arrowheads day and night. Yuna trained the archers. Every day. 2 hours. Of the 40 adult women, 20 knew how to shoot. Of the 20, 10 could hit the target at 50 paces. Of the 10, 3 could hit at 100. Yuna was the best. She shot as naturally as she breathed, effortlessly, without thinking. The arrow flew and hit. Daniel watched her train and thought that in battle she would be worth 10 men, and that in battle he would be worth nothing. His role was different. He was preparing the fortress, not the people, the stones. He had laid one thing that he hadn't shown to anyone but Yuna, the northeast wall, a 20-step section. He had built it in a special way. The lower rows were dry laid without mortar. The upper rows were mortared. From the outside, it looked the same, but the lower rows could be knocked out from the inside with 3 blows from a log. the wall would collapse, outward, on those standing beneath it, a controlled collapse. He explained it to Yuna. She listened in silence. Then she looked at him strangely. She asked if he had set a trap in the wall he was building. He replied that he had. That an engineer building a fortress thinks not only about how it stands, but also about how it falls. That a falling wall is a weapon. That this weapon can be used only once, but once might be enough. Yuna was silent for a long time. Then she said he scared her. Not because he was dangerous, but because he thought 3 moves ahead, and every move included a scenario where someone died. He replied that he didn't want anyone to die, that he built walls so that no one would die. But if someone came to kill them, he'd rather the wall fall on the enemy than on those behind it. Yuna looked at him. Then she nodded. Then she did something she'd never done before. She put her hand on his shoulder. For a second, maybe 2. Then she took it away and left. He stood there and felt the warmth on his shoulder for another minute after she left. Mid-autumn. Daniel was sitting in his room. He had a room now, a small one, in the house by the east wall. A table, a chair, a shelf with blueprints, a window overlooking the square. He sat and looked out the window and thought. 1.5 years. 1.5 years in Hayren. He had built a fortress, not alone, but based on his blueprints. Other hands guided his own, and from mud and stone rose what he had only seen in his mind. And now, sitting in his room, he felt what he had feared from day one. He felt that soon he would no longer be needed. The wall stands, the houses stand, the water system works, the smithy works. Soyeon builds better than he does. Minji calculates better than he does. Kat forges without his blueprints. Hyun knows more than he does about the world they live in. Rain conducts negotiations he never even dreamed of. Yuna protects everyone better than he could ever have dreamed. He looked out the window at the square where women were walking, talking, laughing, carrying firewood and water and tools. They lived. Without him. Almost without him already. He rested his head in his hands and sat like that for a long time. Then he sat up straight. He took out a drawing, a new one, a school, for children, 23 children. They need to learn, to read, to count, to know the world in which they are growing up, and the world they do not know but which exists. He began to draw. The winter of the 2nd year was different. Not that winter of survival when every day was counted from stove to stove. This winter was the first winter of life. In Norin, stoves were burning in 12 houses. Exclusive videos, story continuations, and bonus content are already available on Patreon before YouTube, so check the link in the description for early access to all new recaps and continuations.